All righty, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good morning, good afternoon, or whenever you're watching this, having a good day. Today, we're going to be joined by Mr. Bill Reeder for his part three. And as you know, his first appearance with us, he was flying Mohawks and doing some really crazy missions, battling the trucks, flying the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Second was his second tour where he comes back and goes to flying Cobras in support of MACV-SOG on a lot of hairy missions. And now we are getting him back, and he is going to be telling us his harrowing story, which his first book is about his captivity, or his shoot down, I should say, and his captivity. And we're going to be starting more or less around the day where we last closed, to where he's supporting a special forces camp, Ben Het, that's under siege, and he is shot down. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Bill and let him get us started for today. Mr. Bill, thank you for joining us, sir.
Okay, thank you, Bud, and thank you for having me back on for a third time. But yeah, this will wrap up
Yeah.
the whole great two-tour adventure in Vietnam that ended with me spending time as a prisoner of war. Let me just begin with the mission that day, and we'll go from there. This was May 9th, 1972. It was in the middle of the big Easter offensive of 1972, the largest communist offensive of the war. Many think that was the Tet uprising in 1968, but in fact, the Easter offensive was a much larger enemy operation, enemy incursion. At that time, the enemy had been successful in overrunning much of the Central Highlands. Our mission shifted from principal support to MACV-SOG, though it was a period that they were winding down and doing more training missions and missions in country. But nonetheless, that remained our primary mission until the beginning of the Easter Offensive, and then our mission turned to being the fire brigade and putting out fires across the Highlands. On the 9th of May, 1972, I get launched on a mission at first light in the morning to react to that enemy offensive, first at a former Special Forces camp at Polly Clang, and then a second mission into the old Special Forces camp at Ben Het. Now, by this time in mid 1972, those were no longer Special Forces border camps. They were both occupied by Vietnamese Ranger battalions, 2 battalions at each location, one at Polly Clang, one location being Polly Clang, the other being Ben Het to the north. As we launched out at first light, it was one of those tactical emergency go launch, we'll call you and give you an FM frequency en route, and you contact who you're supporting. We did that. I took off as the mission lead of a flight of 2 COBRA attack helicopters, light fire team. And we flew, you got a good map up there. Thank you. We flew north from Camp Holloway up towards Rocket Ridge. Now you see in that map to the lower left or to the bottom of Rocket Ridge is Polly Clang, that small dot, right there where you're pointing. That was our first mission. We got out there, made contact. The American advisors had both been withdrawn from that camp, so it was just the Vietnamese Rangers we were talking to. They were in a bad way. Indeed, the enemy had attacked them at dawn, and we got there just shortly after that, a few minutes after that. But there were already enemy tanks in the wire. Enemy infantry had overrun the camp, and the friendlies were evacuating to the south and going to try and escape and get away from the clutches of the North Vietnamese. I guess I could comment here as well. These attacks and these forces were all regular North Vietnamese army, not Viet Cong guerrillas. This was regular conventional warfare now with the Easter Offensive. We expended our ordnance, did what we could, which wasn't much. The enemy was fully in control, and we went back to the nearest friendly location with fuel and ammunition, and that was Kon Tum, which you might see, yes, right there where you're pointing, to rearm and refuel. We headed back out from Kon Tum and were diverted from Polly Clang and sent up to Ben Het, which sits well to the north. Another camp, 2 Vietnamese Ranger battalions there, South Vietnamese Ranger battalions, and 2 American advisors, 1 for each battalion. En route, we were told to marry up with a UH-1B, an old Huey helicopter that was en route. He had been retrofitted in the United States with a new sighting system, a new missile system, and sent over there on what was then a classified mission. And we were to fly his gun cover as he went up to Ben Het, and then we do what we could do. I was still the air mission commander in charge of the whole affair. I checked in with Ben Het, talked to the American advisors there. We're told that they were in a bad way. As we crested the hill and could see the camp at Ben Het across the valley that lay before us, it was a sight unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life before. There was it was more like a World War II battlefield than anything I'd seen in Vietnam or in my previous missions, flying missions into Laos. The whole valley was filled with smoke. There were explosions taking place on Ben Het from incoming artillery. There were tracers coming out of the camp. There were enemy tracers going into the camp. As we got closer, I could see that there were tanks in the wire and moving up the hill at Ben Het. Enemy infantry was all over the place. Now, this was the elements of 2 North Vietnamese divisions that were operating in that area. So this was a massive attack against these 2 battalions of probably, maybe 500, 600 people on the ground. Well, maybe not even that much, 300 to 400 people on the ground there, probably total, with their 2 American advisors. We covered the Huey in. Now, that Huey, with those new classified, sophisticated sighting systems and missile systems, what that turned out to be was the prototype for the aerial tow. And that mission at Ben Het that day was the first time that the aerial tow had been employed in actual combat. They'd been in Vietnam for a short time. They'd done some training missions. They had shot some NVA tanks or vehicles that had been captured for training, but this was the first combat engagement against the enemy of the aerial tow missile, and we were there flying with those guys and covering them. So that was quite an experience. They expended their ordnance. They engaged about 5 tanks. There's some debate with the guys on the ground of how many of those tanks the tows actually killed, and their call sign was Hawk's Claw of that Huey, of how many they killed and how many of the guys on the ground killed. But nonetheless, the Hawk's Claw Huey with the tows engaged enemy forces there, and then we all went back to Kontum to rearm and refuel and then head back out. On the way back out, I guess I might mention, because it's going to come up later in the story, on the way back out, there was a South Vietnamese A-1 Sky Raider that was now supporting, there was a flight of Sky Raiders supporting Polly Klang as we flew by, heading up to Ben Het. One of those Sky Raiders got shot down, and we offered to go pick that guy up, but we're told, no, you need to get back up to Ben Het. They continue in a dire way. In fact, the enemy has overrun most all the camp. The surviving friendly forces have withdrawn up to their command bunker complex up on the top of the hill. They are completely out of anti-tank ammunition. They are almost out of small arms ammunition. We've got a Huey inbound that is going to resupply with ammo. He's loaded to the gills with ammo. Would you guys be willing to cover him on his mission in there? And of course, we said we would. We had the Hawk's Claw Huey hold off to the east. And we picked up the resupply Huey going into Ben Het. Now, the challenge was that the weather had been deteriorating all morning, and now here we are on our 3rd turn into combat that morning with a solid overcast cloud cover at something just below 1,000 feet. So we would have had to have come in with 3 olive drab Army Hueys silhouetted against the base of those clouds at just something just under 1,000 feet, which would not have been good. In addition to all the weapons and attacks taking place at Ben Het that I described, there was also anti-aircraft ringing that place like nothing we'd really seen in Vietnam before. There was the typical 51 caliber anti-aircraft machine guns that we had seen, but in numbers we'd never seen before. And there were also the higher caliber anti-aircraft weapons, 23 millimeter, 37 millimeter shooting. So we decided that would not be a good altitude to come screaming in there at. We'd be right in prime range for all the bad guys. So what we elected to do was to adopt a tactic that we often used on our SOG missions, where there was intense AAA, particularly over the border, and we would come in at treetop level. On SOG missions, we generally set up a racetrack pattern with the Cobras right on the treetops, engaging, and then the Huey with the team to either insert or extract would drop down into that racetrack pattern. What we did today, since it was so bad at Ben Het, we put the Huey in the lead. I was in the right rear of the Huey. My wingman was left rear and left rear of me also. And we came screaming in at treetop level, shooting our rockets, front seaters engaging with turret weapons to clear a path for that Huey to get in and do his resupply, which he did. The mission was a success. He got in, he kicked off his load of ammo right up on that command bunker complex. And I can say that made the difference for the guys on the ground at Ben Het. They were able to hold off the enemy for a couple days of battle there and survive. And the camp survived until it was later just intentionally shut down and evacuated during the offensive. Well, we got in just fine. But we, according to the guys on the ground, the American advisor that I've talked to after the war, Mark Truhan, we stirred a hornet's nest. He said the entire countryside opened up on us. We began taking fire, and then as we turned after the Huey dropped his load and the Huey started out, and we began our turn to continue to cover the Huey, we started taking fire from multiple anti-aircraft positions, just riveting my aircraft. Everywhere I looked out of that Cobra, all I could see were tracers. We began taking 51 caliber hits in the tail of the Cobra, just riveting and jolting the aircraft as they hit. It kind of reminded me of someone out there with a jackhammer just working out on the aircraft. Took hits first in the tail, lost the tail rotor, lost directional control. We took hits through the engine, through the fuel cell. Engine was out. Noted instantly rotor RPM start to bleed. I entered auto rotation. We came down out of the sky from just above the treetops, spinning violently and burning. Impacted nose low on the left side, bounced up, spun another turn and a half, and settled in on fire, and soon engulfed in flames and the aircraft exploding. I called to the front seat Tim Connery, great young lieutenant, had only been in the unit for a couple of weeks, made him my assistant platoon leader. He flew with me always since his first flight. We formed into a very tight, very good, effective Cobra fire team, gunship team, and he was in my front seat. At any rate, I remember calling to Tim, saying words to the effect of "Let's get out of this thing." He acknowledged. Now in a Cobra, and we both got out of the aircraft. In a Cobra, it's a tandem seat aircraft, one behind the other. The front seat canopy opens to the left. The back seat canopy opens to the right. So you go out two different directions. Now, luckily, the aircraft settled in upright. It split the skids, but it settled upright so that we could both get out. Otherwise, one guy would not be able to get out of the cockpit. This was before the days of explosive cockpits, explosive canopies. They had some kind of a breakout knife in there to break through the plexiglass. We weren't quite sure how that might work, but luckily in our case, we settled in upright, so we're both able to get out of the cockpit. Tim to the left, me to the right. We were both hurt. I got out somehow, some way. The impact, the trauma was such that I don't remember a whole bunch. I do remember having some difficulty exiting the aircraft. I got my legs wrapped up in something, lap belts, cords, something. But for a time, I was hanging head down outside the aircraft. A part of the story that I didn't learn until actually years later, it was after I got back from my captivity, I got contacted by Mark Truhan, who had been one of the two American advisors there at Ben Het. He he told me, I think it was a letter I got from him first, but he said, "Hey, I was there. I was the advisor on the ground. I have some information about your crash if you'd like to hear it. If not, if you just are trying to move on from all this, I understand. But if you'd like to have some information, I'll pass it along." And so I responded, "Yeah, absolutely. Tell me anything." So here's what he shared with me, and I still have the letter somewhere, and Mark is still alive to substantiate this. But here's what Mark said. He said, "Your COBRA crashed, and I saw the back seat having trouble getting out of the aircraft, just laying there head down out the side of the cockpit. The aircraft was burning and exploding." And he said, this is a story he shared. He had seen a truck accident on the New Jersey Turnpike years before from the window of some hotel where he was spending the night. He said that the truck burned, and the truck driver burned to death in that truck, and it was a horrible thing. And he said, "I was not going to let anything like that happen again, so I was going to put you out of your misery." I raised my rifle because we were just outside the perimeter there of Ben Hett. I mean, we were right on the edge of the camp. He said, "I raised my rifle and put you in my sights, and just before I squeezed the trigger, I hesitated just a moment. And in that moment, smoke came around the cockpit, and I couldn't see. And then when the smoke cleared, you were gone." It still brings chills to me when I think of that and recount how close he had come to putting me out of my misery, as he said, but didn't. Well, somehow I got free, and the next thing, and then I was unconscious. I came to sometime later, laying in the weeds, and it was thick forest and brush right on the edge of the jungle. So we were right up next to the jungle, but within view of the camp, where the camp could see us. Somehow I'd gotten out. I lost consciousness. I remember coming to, laying in the weeds. I remember coming in and out of consciousness several times before I even started to be able to think and try to recall what happened and what my situation was. As I did, I was, for my first recollection, I was unable to move anything. And eventually, with much difficulty, I could start getting my arms in motion and moving. And then eventually, I was able to get up on my hands and knees and crawl around. My first thought, of course, was, I got to find Tim. Where's my front seat? Now, I knew I was hurt badly. I don't think I really appreciated exactly how badly I was hurt. I did have a shell fragment in my right ankle through my boot, which I was able to reach down and pull out. What I didn't know is I had broken my back badly. I had a severe compression fracture, just about completely destroying my L1 vertebrae. So yeah, I came out of Vietnam an inch and a half shorter on that tour than what I arrived with. So I had the broken back, had the shell fragment wound in my ankle. I had burns on the back of my neck from these explosions. I had some head and face wounds, just minor wounds really, but head wounds bleed badly. So there was a lot of blood, and there I was. But got crawling, looked for Tim, was not able to find him at all. And I knew that I had to do something. I could hear enemy moving in the area. I knew they were coming for the helicopter. I could hear some Air Force aircraft that had come in behind us to start providing support to Ben Hett. And there was an AC-130 that was shooting up the countryside. And so I figured I needed to move. I was not going to be able to stay where I was. I needed to get out of there. Now, the closest, the most obvious solution was these guys up on the hill, just a few hundred yards away from me. That was Friendly's. There was sanctuary up in their command bunker complex. But to get there, I would have had to work my way through, all these fire bases in Vietnam, and particularly the big camps like Ben Hett had rolls of concertina wire in multiple layers all around the camp. Between the rows of concertina wire were anti-personnel mines. There was one little roadway up that could have been available, but I would have had to get through all of that. I would have had to, and in the process, work my way through these thousands of attacking enemy and tanks that were up there doing battle, and make my way up to the friendlies at the top, all the while hoping that the friendlies didn't mistake me for one of the enemy and shoot me in the process. So even in my muddled mental state because of my head wound, obviously severe concussion, I decided that was not a reasonable course of action. My plan B, the other course that I saw available to me, was to move in the opposite direction to get to the next friendly place, the next place still under friendly control, and that was Khartoum. That was about 40 miles away. I was no doubt in my young 26-year-old mind that I could make it, even crawling around in the jungle. And as I said, I finally got up and could walk just very stooped over in a hunched position to get to the nearest friendly place, and that would be Khartoum, about 40 miles away. So I headed from Ben Het. My plan was to come down the west side of the Rocket Ridge there and work my way down to Khartoum. So that's what I started out to do. That was in May 1972 that I was shot down, and that evening I headed out and started moving southeast to get to Khartoum.
I mean, that's a long trek right there. Were you on the eastern side of Ben Het over here, or were you closer to Laos when you went down? Or
you see where that dot is below Ben Het? I was, and there's a little black dot where it says Ben Het, right there at the word, yeah. And there's a little road that was just a little more than a cart track that ran just to the south of the camp. The camp was up on the hill just to the north of that dot, just to the north of the road. And I was shot down just barely a little bit south of the road. The old airstrip of Ben Het was just barely on the north side of the road, and then the hill went up a little bit further to the north. So I was just on the southern tip of that dot, just on the south side of the road, just on the edge of the jungle down there.
Wow. I mean, to do and to even try and well, you had nothing else you could do. You had to at least attempt it. 40 miles. Excuse me. Did you in the crash did any of your survival gear survive? Your car 15, your pistol, anything like that? Your strobe signals, anything?
Yeah, here's a lesson learned in the process. If you have a violent wreck of any kind, be it an airplane, car, or boat, you will exit that craft or vehicle with what you have strapped to your body, and that is it. So I ended up in a critical E&E situation with no weapon. Well, I had my knife, so yeah, no firearm. And here's the story behind that, very briefly. Our issue weapon was a 38 caliber 6-shot revolver pistol. I had such a pistol on my body on my first tour of duty flying Mohawks when I was shot down in the middle of Laos with the enemy in hot pursuit. And I pulled that little 6-shooter out and looked at it and said, hey, this is not going to be a Custer's last stand. This thing isn't going to do me much good. I holstered that. Then, as I said in my other podcast and in my book about my Mohawk tour, my wingman put down close air support suppressive fires. I moved quickly through the jungle until the 20th SOS Air Force Special Ops got in with a Huey and plucked me out of the jungle. Okay, come to second tour. I report in. Now I'm in another special mission unit, the Great 361st Pink Panthers, mission supporting MACV-SOG on some very harrowing missions. And what are we issued for a firearm? Once again, a Smith & Wesson 38 caliber pistol. Okay. Thanks to our dear friends at FOB2 in CCC, I was able to have one of them offer me up a CAR-15. I guess their weapons accountability wasn't quite what the rest of the Army accountability was, but I got a CAR-15. So I proudly, on all my missions, I carried that CAR-15. It sat right behind the seat of my COBRA, right behind my back seat, with 3 bandoliers of ammunition. If I ever got shot down and got in a tight spot, I could now fight off the enemy. I had a weapon worthy of resisting the Viet Cong or the NVA. Problem was, in that crash, again, I don't remember exactly how I got out of that aircraft. It was difficult. The thing was exploding. I had problems. I did not have my CAR-15. I did not have 3 bandoliers of ammo. I had a knife. So yeah, there I was.
Like you said, you concussed, broken back, and that just getting out of the bird was your it took all you could get, much less trying to grab anything out of that thing. So,
Yep. Yep.
did the bird was the bird recovered, or did they airstrike that as you went further?
Well, I don't think there was anything left. When I first came to in the weeds, I could feel the heat of the explosions. I could hear rounds cooking off. That thing just incinerated out there. I mean, I'm sure there was probably some piece of something, a little bit of tail, maybe a little bit of wing stub or something, but it essentially just disintegrated itself.
My gosh. And that's why I was glad you mentioned the part, the first, shall we say, tribulation, not after the wreck. That was the first, but the
Mhm.
one on the ground, shall we say, of you trying to get out and hung up, and here this man is at Ben Hat watching all of this and is gonna shoot you. And thank God, even though you're about to go through some bad stuff, thank God that smoke blurred his vision and he held off, because geez, I mean, I you'd have been done. But I mean, I can't even think how. I mean, that would have just been
Uh,
crazy. I have
I finally met him face to face in Washington, D.C. many years later. It was at a Vietnam helicopter pilots reunion in Washington. He lives up in Vermont, and he came down for the reunion. In fact, they had a bit of a presentation there in a room during the reunion that was keyed on the Battle of Khartoum and discussions of the Battle of Khartoum. And he was there, and we got introduced in the meeting for the first time face to face, and he recounted that incident. My wife was there with me, and our 2 young children. Melanie and I met and married after the war, and these 2 children were born after the war. And so Mark was sharing the story, and he just commented. He said, "Yeah, I don't know what caused me to hesitate for that moment." And Melanie, I need to do this without getting too emotional about it. Melanie looked at him and looked at the 2 kids and motioned towards them. And she said, "That's why you hesitated." So, yeah.
Wow. Getting to meet him, I can't imagine the feelings that brought up, and finally getting to put a face to the person who told you the story, and you hearing it and finally getting to see him. I cannot imagine what that.
Yeah.
Wow. I have some photos of Ben Het way back from '68, and I'm wondering if it looked anything like this when you were flying the area.
Yeah, it's the ridge line down there to the south in the valley. That might be down by the airstrip.
Yes, sir. I think I see a helipad circle. Here's a little lookout.
Yeah, that I think is out towards the south, towards Rocket Ridge, way out there. That one's kind of misty. If these are, yeah, and that's going up the hill. Yeah.
Or so, yeah. I mean, yeah. Wow, it is completely surrounded out there in no man's land.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, they
It
AO'd.
was the last. It's the last major position before you get to the Laotian border.
Oh, wow. No wonder it was getting tanks and all of that. And for you to see the implementation of the first combat use of the tow missile, did you actually get eyes on getting to see them shoot,
Oh
or
yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. No,
were they?
we provided their cover until once they expended their missiles. Then they peeled off, and we put in the rest of our ordnance where Truhan and the other American advisor it said they needed some work, and we shot at some enemy infantry primarily that were attacking, and then went back for our rearm refuel. No, so we're right there in the middle of it, and yeah, that's where we saw the 37 millimeters coming up and exploding at altitude. It was a very intense day.
Yeah, with all of that, I can't imagine. I mean, tow missiles coming out, 37s coming out, and you're seeing, human waves, tanks, and everything else trying to take Ben Head. I didn't know. Did you say it Ben Head or Polly Klang that there was, or clearly Polly Klang now? Only Vietnamese, no more American at Polly Klang when you were supporting them that first time out.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into my opinions on stuff a lot, but yeah, the 2 American advisors are pulled out of Polly Klang. In fact, I was on that mission, and that's in my book as well. And the guy that went in and pulled them out, it was a nighttime mission. It had gotten dark. The decision was made to extract American advisors because the situation was so intense in the Highlands. So it was Jim Stein from B Troop 717th Cav. He was the Air Cav platoon leader, Aero Scout platoon leader. He flew an OH-6 in there with me covering him, and Tim Connery was in my front seat as well, same front seat, and my wing, and that was just all kinds of fire. That was a real intense mission as well. But he got those American advisors out of there. Now at Ben Het, those 2 guys, they refused to be evacuated. They said, no, we're staying. We're the advisors to these Vietnamese battalions. We're going to stay with our battalions. I could only wonder what those 2 South Vietnamese Ranger battalions at Polly Klang thought when they are instructed to stay there and defend and fight to the death, and yet it's too dangerous for their American advisors, and they're being pulled out. That just must have been a very odd feeling for them, and may have contributed to the fact that they weren't able to resist more than they were, and that they did get overrun as quickly as they did that morning. But yeah, the 2 guys were on the ground at Ben Het still because they had refused to be pulled out.
Yeah, sounded like Mr. or Polly Klang needed somebody there to keep them fighting, like Mr. Jim Duffy or John. Is it John or Jim Duffy?
John Duffy.
John Duffy to keep them whipped into shape and not fearing because the Americans not running. And for you to be able to talk on the radio with them is also amazing. I didn't even think about that.
It was a little difficult because of language, but they did have an English speaker on the radio, and I was able to talk to him. But yeah, it's regrettable, and in one major way, one of the, if not the principal role of an American advisor with a Vietnamese unit is not so much to tell them how to fight, particularly when you're dealing with Rangers or airborne paratroopers. These guys have been fighting for years, and the elite forces, at least in the Vietnamese Army, the paratroopers, Rangers, and Marines were pretty damn good at it. So they didn't need some young lieutenant or Army captain, or in the case of Firebase Charlie, Major Duffy, telling them what to do. But what the American advisor provided was a direct link and line to fire support, be it artillery, Air Force close air support, COBRA attack helicopters, all of that, even B-52 strikes, AC-130. The channel to get that stuff was through the American advisor. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean that shows you why they didn't hold out, and I mean, heck, how can you blame them when they're up against what they're up against with nothing like you just described backing them up, Yeah, so guys, we're not gonna go crazy into this because you guys need to buy the book. You can watch Jocko. He's gonna go more in depth. He and Mr. Bill went pretty good in depth, but we're not gonna do that. We're gonna talk a little bit about it, but you guys need to buy the book because it's literally one of the Vietnam books that every person who enjoys reading about the war needs to get. It covers a lot of stuff from the air, but also some of the stuff we're about to talk about. But so I guess we can kind of now begin with you last 3 days, as you mentioned, you're busted up, off the get-go, you're hurt bad, something's wrong, and it's going to be a struggle. But as you mentioned, I believe a COBRA, well, one of those days ends up, you've got a strobe on and ends up accidentally firing up your position that you've got to get away from and get your strobe off. And then I believe it's the next night, which would be your third day alone, you begin hearing voices and finally manage to walk into a group of NVA.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, the COBRA and strobe light situation, that was that first evening. I started moving away from the crash site, doing as best I could to move to the southeast. I knew it was going to take me, I figured maybe a couple weeks to go 40 miles through the jungle in the state that I was in, the condition that I was in. Again, no doubt that I could make it though. So I start stumbling to the south, and I could never find Tim. I just couldn't find him. I looked and couldn't find him. So started moving to the southeast. It was getting dark. It was dark. I heard helicopters coming in. And now here's a side note. There was no formal rescue attempt made to get me out of there. That decision was made by Mr. John Paul Vann, who was the senior American running operations in 2 Corps. He was a civilian, former Army Lieutenant Colonel, who went to work, I think it was with USAID initially, but he was in the advisory role. He was the senior advisor for 2 Corps over all operations, including military. Now, to legally pass orders to military forces, he had a U.S. Army 1 or 2 star always functioning as his deputy, and his orders would go through that individual. But Van made the decision there'd be no rescue attempt made. I don't really hold anything against him for that. We were only, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks past the Bat 21 incident up there in the DMZ, where we lost a whole bunch of Americans trying to get one guy out. So it was to be we wouldn't just commit resources to any rescue. And he knew that we were up against, the elements of 2 NVA divisions up there, lots of stuff going on. So he decided no rescue attempt will be made. So none of that was ever ginned up or generated. However, Army aviators, being what they are, from my unit and from B Troop 717th, decided they would, they designed a mission. They called it a reconnaissance and force or something, but they were just going up on a mission that had nothing, at least publicly announced, nothing to do with me or up my shoot down. So that was this flight of Cobras that came in right at dark with an OH-6, a Loach. Now this Loach was piloted once again by Jim Stein from B Troop 717th. I could hear the Loach go to the ground, and I assumed that they had gotten my front seat, Tim, and then heard the Loach come back up, and the Cobras, the whole flight started coming out. And in that flight, they were approaching where I was. So I pulled out my strobe light out of my survival vest, which blinks a white flashing light. We had these blue cellophane covers that have been made to put over it so that it would not be mistaken for enemy fire, that it would be a blue strobing flashing light. And I put that cover on. I held my strobe light up and went blink, blink, blink. And the lead Cobra was coming, and the lead Cobra opened up on me with his minigun out of the turret, and it came close. And I had worked so hard to get up on my feet to stumble along, and I fell right back to the ground. The round's very close. I looked down, that freaking strobe is still blink, blink, blink. I grabbed that and turned it off, and then finally got back up on my hands and knees and got up on my feet and continued my journey. I talked to the front seat of that Cobra after I was released years later. It was Bentley Hill was his name, and Bentley passed far too young many years ago. But so I relate this whole thing to Bentley, that the lead Cobra opened up on me with a turret. And he said, "Oh yeah, I was flying front seat." He said, "All I saw was enemy fire that I was returning fire on." So there we were.
The blue didn't seem to work to the desired effect. The cover.
But so that was the first incident already in the first night out, and I stumbled through the jungle for 3 days, and all sorts of things happened, which I cover in the book, from nearly being captured by the enemy a couple of times, to being right on the edge of B-52 strikes, to finally on the third day and getting an F-4 flight of F-4s put in on me because a forward air controller thought I was a bad guy in the middle of a bombed out area. To the third day, I was coming down the side of a hill off of trails, just crashing through the jungle, and I heard voices, not more than, God, I don't know, 20 feet or so in front of me, maybe 30 feet. And I stopped and froze, and the jungle was thick there. I mean, you talk about a fog being so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. I think if I had put my hand out, there'd have been so much foliage that I probably couldn't have seen my hand. It was just thick jungle. But I froze my tracks, squatted down, hoping that, and I didn't know Vietnamese at the time, other than I think, what was it, Nook Dai for ice water or something like that. And the Nook Mom was some fish sauce that stunk. And yeah, so I knew about 2 or 3 words of Vietnamese. I knew really none of the tribal mountain yard language. So these guys started squawking. I didn't know if they're mountain yards or South Vietnamese or North Vietnamese or I had no idea who these guys were, but I just didn't want anything to do with them and crouched down, hoping they would think I was some kind of animal in the area. And when they didn't hear any more, they'd go on about their business. But that was not. So it was just within a few seconds, I had 5 very young, uniformed North Vietnamese soldiers with their AK-47 rifles pointed at me, motioning for me to stand up. And in that instant, I knew I was captured. I knew I was a prisoner of war. It's a horrible, sinking feeling that's about impossible to describe. I was in a bad way. I had the wounds that I described. I'd been going through the jungle for 3 days. My beard, I got a pretty heavy beard, had grown with blood and dirt and mud all caked in it. I because of my broken back and my initial temporary paralysis, which never fully resolved even when I was able to hobble, I'd had no control of my bowels or bladder for 3 days. So I'd been messing all over myself. I picked up a number of leeches in the jungle, which I pulled a bunch of them off, but still had some leeches hanging from me. So I was a pretty sorry sight. And these guys had me. I was a pretty sorry sight, but I still had my freedom. I could still, when I decided to sit down and rest, I did. When I decided to walk and move, I did. If I decided to go left or right or straight ahead, those were all my decisions. In that instant when those guys captured me, that freedom was gone. Everything about my life was now under the control of the enemy. Everything that I did was at the time and way that they told me to do it. The only freedom that I had left, and I cherished it for every moment I was in captivity. The only freedom I had left was in my mind, in my head, and wow. I lived there a lot and did a lot of things in my mind. But that's where my freedom was. So yeah, I was in that instant captured and became a prisoner of war.
You do a good job of describing the feeling, much like you did right then, of relaying what it's like as best you can of losing your sense of freedom. It's like for those of you that have ever been in trouble and locked up overnight, what have you, causing trouble. Just imagine when those doors slam home and that feeling you've got to where no one's listening to you, no one can help you, no one's going to do anything. You're just there. Multiply that by 1,000,000% now with men with weapons at you. If you mess up or fall behind, they're just going to go ahead and get rid of you. So this is what he has now entered, to put that in perspective. And like you said,
in that moment after capture too, I didn't erase something. I didn't know if those guys were going to shoot me right then. I didn't know if life was over or what was going to happen. Just complete unknowns.
The way you kind of described that first, they're jittery, they're clearly caught off guard to see an American like this so up close, and you there for a minute reading the book, it almost sounds like they're thinking about shooting you, or rattled enough that they're, you make a false move or do something, they're going to shoot you.
Yep.
What and you kind of get into it in the book, so we don't want to give too much of away, but when you first get them, what is because you're gonna make a trek, and we'll get into a little bit of that, but what's the first thing they do? They've got the weapons on you. Do they immediately grab you and start going through anything you've got on, or do they immediately bound you and make you, quote unquote, a prisoner?
Yeah, no, they didn't even bind me. They motioned me up. I stood up, and they started shouting a bunch of stuff that I didn't understand at each other, at me. Yeah, because they were probably as shocked as I was. They were a ways away from the battle at this point. I'd moved for 3 days away from Ben Het, not far in my wounded, injured state, but I did move some distance. At any rate, they motioned me. We went down a short distance. I said I'd heard them probably about 10 yards away. They took me down there. There was a little stream. They picked up a bunch of canteens. There was a trail that went up the other side of the hill, the other side of the stream, and marched me up that trail. And we shortly came to the top of the hill, to a big cleared out area. And the area, it was cleared out of bushes and brush, but the trees remained and the canopy remained, so that it was not observable from the air. And under that, in that area, I could see hundreds of uniformed North Vietnamese soldiers, stacks of food supplied, rice bags, ammunition stacks. So unknowingly, I had been in my journey to the southeast, just along the western edge of Rocket Ridge there in that valley, or coming up into those hills, had come up to one of the major staging areas for the battles that were taking place, and had stumbled right into the midst of them. These guys, these 5 guys, have been down at that stream collecting water to take it back up in their canteens. That's how I came upon them.
Jeez. I mean, that and that I can only imagine how serious the mood changed then, because now you see these are clearly NVA soldiers that are participating in the attacks that you've been flying over and destroying. So
Yep.
was there ever? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was saying, so the guys that captured me, they took me up to the middle of this camp, and some other soldiers came around. They took away my survival vest, took off my boots, my socks, took everything and left me in my flight suit. We were wearing 2-piece Nomex flight suits in those days, and left me with my 2-piece Nomex flight suit and sitting there with nothing else, and barefoot, waiting to see what would happen from there.
Of course, gotta take your boots from me. Got to.
Mm-hmm.
That's and how that's another part. How you do this barefooted in the book is I'll never understand that as well. On top of everything else you're facing. Let's see here. I made some notes. We're gonna kind of skip over a little bit because you're there for a little bit of time, but. Can you tell us a little bit about the beginning of before you end up meeting up with some of the South Vietnamese, some of the really where it starts getting bad, where they're basically doing the BS of, here, sign this, you're a war criminal, you've committed wars against or killed old people, herbicide, committed chemical
warfare, genocide, and ecocide. Yeah, that's the word.
Yes, yes, sir.
Big words that I barely understood at the time. They got them somewhere. Yeah, I mean, just not to go through everything there. I was captured, held there, kind of just became a curiosity of the camp for that afternoon, until they found some English-speaking interrogator. I think he was probably an intel officer, had a pretty spiffy-looking uniform for the jungle, at any rate. And so I was interrogated for 3 days, tortured for 3 days during interrogation, first tied up to a tree and beat, and then pulled off the tree and had my arms tied behind my back and pulled ever tighter. The communists love what we ended up calling rope tricks to to use on prisoners. I didn't know any of that at the time, but at any rate, arms pulled behind my back through interrogation, and as I didn't answer, they'd be tighter and tighter. Eventually, they pulled my arms close enough where the elbows touched, and both my shoulders dislocated, which continued to cost me. So I've had, since I returned, I've had surgeries on my back, on both shoulders, but life goes on. It's very good. Yeah, and after a few days of that, I was given my boots back with no. There was a mock execution there too. Yeah, the details of all of it are in the book. Given my boots back with no laces, and given a small bag of uncooked rice with a couple ropes tied to it. So that became my ruck to haul my own food ration. And I set out with. And that was, after being asked to sign confessions and statements that we just talked about, that I had been guilty of all this stuff. Set out through the jungle with 2 North Vietnamese soldiers guarding me. Neither one of them spoke English, other than one phrase that they had been taught, which I didn't understand until we got into the 3rd day, I think. The phrase was "Go quick or die," which I finally figured out was "Go quick or die." As they poked me with their rifles, and I could barely stumble along. I was in bad shape. All right, so we walked 1 day south and 2 days west, and ended up in the jungles of northern Cambodia. Suffered some airstrikes and other stuff along the way. Got to my first prison camp, which was a jungle camp in northern Cambodia. So it was across the border into Cambodia. Just to describe it briefly, and then we'll get with the Vietnamese and go from there. But that camp, we came, and after, you can imagine walking through the jungle with boots and no laces and no socks. By the time I finished 3 days of that and arrived at this jungle camp, my feet were something like hamburger meat on the bottom. I was, and everything else. I was in a bad way. All right, the first camp, to describe it, was on the edge of a valley in the northern Cambodia jungles. The valley was kind of grassy, jungle on the side, a lot of bamboo all over the place. As we came across this valley, I could see the camp, and it was made of bamboo, kind of like an old Western cavalry fort, but with the bamboo sticking up instead of logs. And it was probably, 10 feet high, 12 feet high, some guard towers. And as we got close, I could see the entrance. And as we got closer, I could see that the bamboo wall around was, in fact, 2 concentric bamboo walls, about maybe 10 feet apart, with a ditch dug, maybe 6 or 8 feet deep. And to cross this ditch, there was a log that had been flattened on the top, and that was what we had to cross to get into the camp. Now, in the ditch, what I didn't mention were also punji stakes all over the place. 2-foot pieces of bamboo, sharpened on both ends, stuck in the ground with one sharp spike sticking up. Most often, I don't know that was the case there, but we knew that most often punji stakes would be dipped in human waste. So if the impalement didn't kill you, the resulting infection would. And I'm hobbling up to this log with horrible balance, feet terrible, and wondering how I'm going to get across this log. And all I could think of, it's amazing how our Army training comes back at the appropriate times. In basic training, as I had begun as an enlisted man and then gone to officer candidate school, in basic training, we had the old bayonet courses that we had to run. And you fix your bayonet on your M14 rifle, their M14s then, rifle, and would run this bayonet course. And they had these like straw dummies all over the place with an arm that stuck out. You'd push the arm back and stab it, yelling, "Kill, kill, kill," in your loudest, most violent voice you could muster. If you didn't do well, the drill sergeants were there to scream and yell at you. But I remember one of them, we had to run across a log to the dummy on the other side, stab it, kill, kill, and go on. And the drill sergeant, I remember barking at me as I was running up there. He said, "Just keep running, focus on the other side of the log, keep going, don't stop, don't slow down, go." And I did. So at this moment now, I'm approaching this jungle camp with a log crossing this punji stake line pit. And that whole scene came back to my mind. Just look at the other side, focus on the other side, keep going. And I did, and got across that log and got inside my first prison camp in the jungles there in Cambodia.
Uh, and I mean, guys, y'all got to keep in mind he's walking all of this distance. I mean, he's going to go even further walking, and with a broken back, and it just keeps getting worse. Malaria, your dysentery, it gets very, very bad. And they've already begun the torture, as we mentioned. Now, is this first camp? Is this where you meet up with the South Vietnamese gentlemen, the officers from the Air
Yeah,
Force and Army?
I do. I do. I was there. There, I was kept in a bamboo cage with a log split longitudinally, laying down the middle of the cage with holes cut in it. So they'd raise the top of the log, and you'd stick your feet through the holes, and they'd lower the top of the log, so you were in stocks and wooden stocks in those cages. And my first cage was a good sized cage, but I was crammed in there with a couple dozen South Vietnamese prisoners who had been scooped up during this offensive. Many of them captured from Firebase Charlie, with where Duffy had fought, because one of his companies got overwhelmed and most all of them captured. So they were there in that camp. Everybody wounded, me wounded, bad shape. The guy laying next to me died a few days into it. I woke up in the morning and there he is laying over there dead. He'd been hurt badly, being starved to death. We got just a little bit of rice to eat in that camp. I was losing weight rapidly. That's where I started to get sick. And I had all the wounds I described. Now I got bloody dysentery, amoebic dysentery. I got 3 kinds of intestinal parasites, which I know because I still had them when I got released, and they were found and diagnosed and treated. I got 3 different kinds of malaria, which I know because when I got released, I still had 3 different kinds of malaria that were diagnosed and treated. And one of them is very often fatal. I forget that I had malaria, malariae, falciparum malaria, and I can't remember that, but I had three different kinds. So yeah, I was in a bad way. Everybody else was in a bad way. People were dying. That camp was pretty big. There were about 300 prisoners in that camp. Myself, and I would learn one other American, and people dying every day from the conditions. And I was getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, one day they pulled me out of my cage, and I found myself standing in the center of the camp with 25 South Vietnamese prisoners, all officers in the South Vietnamese Army, myself and the one other American, Wayne Finch. And that was where I met up with those guys. We were given a little pep talk by the camp authorities that one of the South Vietnamese interpreted and translated for Wayne and I, which was essentially, you're going to be moved to a new camp, a camp with better conditions, better food, have medical treatment will be available. You might even get some letters and even packages from home. This camp is going to be maybe up to 11 days away, a difficult journey, but you should try very hard to make it. And with that, they tied our arms loosely behind our backs this time, tied us together with a good length, 8-10 feet of rope. So that was all loose, nothing tight. And off we stepped into the jungle to make this 11-day march.
Only
They did not give us our shoes or boots back, so we were barefoot. But that actually worked out for the best. If I got those boots back with no laces and no socks, that would have been a catastrophe. So my feet toughened up over time. I mean, they still got ripped to shreds, and I think I broke every toe and ripped most of my toenails off from whatever, but it was still better than trying to walk with boots and no laces and no shoes.
Holy cow! As you said, one of the men you end up making the long march, and as we find out in the book, it's not 11 days. It's a lot longer than that. But one of the men that actually, I believe you said on Jocko that you credit him as one of the men that kept you alive. He was in the A1 that was shot down defending Ben Het. I believe it was Lieutenant, is it Son?
Yeah, Sang Nguyen. Yeah, Sang was, and I think he was the one that was interpreting the communist speech as we set out. And I didn't find out till we were underway, and we got talking on the trip that he said, "Hey, I was shot down I was an A1 pilot." We started sharing stuff back and forth, and oh, okay, where were you shot down? Well, I was shot down at Poly Clang, and I said, when? And he said, the 9th of May. I said, it's the same day I was shot down. I said, whoa, you're the guy that I wanted to go. I asked to go rescue you. I saw your parachute. But, so we became very, very good friends. He helped me a lot. And yes, he did end up saving my life along the way. Because as you said, this journey turned out to not be 11 days. And the first day or two, I wondered how I was. Well, the first day when we started, I wondered how I was even going to make it to the end of that day. I could barely walk. But I did just one foot in front of the other, and just worry about what's immediately ahead of you. Don't worry about what's going to happen next week. And I made it through the first day, second day, and on. And yeah, the 11-day trip turned out to take over 3 months. It turned into just a huge death march along the way. Wayne Finch, the other American, died. 6 of the South Vietnamese prisoners died or were executed for not being able to keep up. My ankle wound got so infected that it was like dragging a big club along with my right leg. It was just awful. And I got to the point where I couldn't go any further. I knew we have more that we can reach down inside to get than we think we have. And I had pulled that stuff out up for on several occasions, but I just got to a point I could not go anymore. My leg was so infected. It was cracked and oozing, and I don't want to get too much into all that. If you want the real gory details, are in the book. And I collapsed in the trail, and I couldn't get up. And I knew the fate. I knew what happened to others, that they'd been shot and killed when they couldn't go on. And I'm laying there. The guards are screaming at me. Weapons are out. And the next thing I know, I'm looking up at what my memory at the time was. This big, strong, buff South Vietnamese A1 Sky Raider pilot, my friend Sang, was there lifting me up, and helping him was one of Duffy's guys, a Lieutenant Hung from the Firebase Charlie thing had been captured, and Hung and Sang are lifting me up. They get me onto Sang's back with my arms around his shoulders. And so he's holding me with my arms around his shoulders, dragging me through the jungle. And he and Hung alternated through the day until they got me to the next camp, where along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the enemy had encampments, bivouac areas. And if you could get to a bivouac area, you might have a chance of surviving. If you couldn't make it in the middle, they'd shoot you. They wouldn't mess with you. So they dragged me through the jungle and got me to the next bivouac camp. So I again have them to thank for my life. I have Wayne Finch helped me a lot along the way too, as did others. There was another Vietnamese officer later on, K Nhiem, who helped me. And Kay's help, he had been on the headquarters of the 22nd ARVN Division that had been overrun in this whole Easter offensive. And he had hid a Gold Cross pen, which is worth quite a bit of money, in the lining of his uniform. And he was going to use it to trade for something, should he get captured. Well, he in one camp in the north, when I was really, in fact, it was a camp where Wayne Finch had died, and I was in a bad way. And Kay traded that pen. I don't know what he was doing, talking to some local militia guy, but he gave the guy the pen, and the guy showed back up with 6 potatoes. And Kay had traded that pen for those potatoes for me. And each day for 6 days, one of those potatoes would be cooked and given to me. And none of the other Vietnamese would take them, because they were, the South Vietnamese would take them because they were for me. So yeah, I owe my life to a few people, but luckily I survived that over 3-month trip north, and ended up making it to the Hanoi Hilton. That trip was the most difficult. Those 3 months on the Ho Chi Minh Trail coming up through Laos and North Vietnam was the most difficult thing I have experienced in my entire life. And that's really, I think, the meat of the book is to see what that was like. And that's what separates my book from those others. That's one reason I wanted to write it, because most of the stuff written by and about prisoners of war in Vietnam were focused on the guys in the North. The Air Force, Marine, Navy fighter pilots were shot down and scooped up rather quickly and moved into the formal prison system in fairly short order. Now, their ordeal was horrible, and they suffered a lot. But what I went through was different, and I wanted that story to be understood as well. And a good part of this book is about all the details that happened during that horrible, horrible trek, moving from that jungle camp in Cambodia into North Vietnam. Ultimately, myself getting put into the formal prison system in Hanoi. First at the Plantation Gardens and then later at the Hanoi Hilton.
There is a gate, and I've been led to believe that, I don't know if that's you, but it did have, when I looked you up, it had Bill Reeder in prison here, and I have
Yeah.
no way of verifying, but.
Well, here's your verification, okay? That's me. That's
Holy
me.
crap.
And my friend Al Kroboth is just to the right side of the picture to my left. Yeah,
Wow.
that picture is of a section of the Hanoi Hilton where we were kept, and that section was called Little Vegas. None of these were names that the Vietnamese associated with that prison. That prison was built by the French long ago. It was called Hoa Lo, so the Americans gave it all the names, but the prison as a whole became the most famous, the Hanoi Hilton. So I had found that picture. I had seen the picture, and that shows our little corner of Little Vegas. When I was getting ready to publish the book, I needed a high resolution copy. So I went up the DoD site and found a really good high resolution copy of the photo. And when I looked at it, I saw those two faces peering out the window and enlarged it and said, "Whoa, that's me." That's me and my buddy Al. Where this picture was taken, with the peace agreements were signed on the 17th of January, 1973. Releases took place over a period of 60 days, beginning, it was through February and March, there were releases. So this picture was taken by one of the international members of a team that came to get one of the early release groups, and they were in our area, and one of the guys snapped that photo, and it ended up getting into the DoD archives. So that's me waiting for my release, which isn't going to come for some time later. This is after the war, during one of the early releases. But that is the cell that we were in the Hanoi Hilton there.
Holy cow. That is, I'm speechless. I've seen a lot of interesting photos in these past 6 years doing this, but that is very, very interesting. For you to be there at that moment in time and then be able to find it all these years later. God, that's amazing. How you had mentioned peace agreements going on. Is it, I'm not going to say better or good treatment, but since all of this is going on, it's after the war. Has some of the notoriously bad treatment we hear about maybe during John McCain's time and all of that, had it calmed down, or were they still trying to give y'all as much hell, so to speak, as they could possibly give y'all? Or
the treatment in Hanoi had gotten quite a bit better late in the war, in the final stages of the war. So the real brutal treatment in Hanoi had concluded even before I got there, before the war even ended. I got there on the 10th of October, 1972, when I arrived. And it wasn't, I didn't have any torture in Hanoi at all.
wow.
I did have a lot of some interrogation, a lot of indoctrination, and some, I don't even know how I'd describe it. They weren't nice people at all. Once the peace agreements were signed on January 17th, 73, then the enemy tried to put a whole new face on how they were treating the prisoners in the Hilton, and things improved dramatically after that. We got very meager food rations before the war ended. And they'd go through periods. At first, we were getting some bean sprouts twice a day on a little metal plate with a piece of pretty funky bread by the side. And I thought it was great when I first got there because all I'd had was rice coming up the trail, and I was skin and bone. But you'd get the bean sprouts for weeks on end, and then they'd change to whatever was in season next. So we had bean sprouts, we had pumpkin soup, we had kohlrabi, we had cabbage, and yeah, it wasn't very good. After the war ended, we got as much as we wanted to eat, almost of anything, and we got little cans of mystery meat and I didn't care what it was meat, and we got fruit and bananas, and so yeah, the treatment changed dramatically once the peace agreements were signed. I think they were trying to do two things: fatten us up before we came home. Now, I didn't come out until one of the last release groups on March 27th, the end of March 1973. So they'd been fattening me up since January 17th. But still, when I got on the scales at Clark Air Base, when we landed in the Philippines, I weighed only 140 pounds. So I figured I had been down to something less than 120 pounds at my low point coming up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I've been in pretty bad shape. I know when I looked at myself at those times, I just saw nothing but bones with skin hanging on them. It was not a pretty sight. Yep.
I mean, that is the book and story is just it is wild. I did have a question and a little bit of story as we're starting to close out here. I was curious, and it'll lead to two questions about people who were there. And I was going to see if maybe you knew they were there or if they were still there. Were you a part of Operation Homecoming, like when John Caviani and Mr. Carol Flora from SOG ended up coming home?
I was a part of Operation Homecoming. That's what they called all the C-141 flights that brought us out of Hanoi. And then there were some prisoners who stayed in the South for the entire war. The ones captured down in 3 and 4 Corps in the southern part of South Vietnam never came north. The rest of us did. So that was Operation Homecoming. The picture you have there is my release in Hanoi on March 27th, reporting to an Air Force one-star general who took control of us. You'll see the formation of prisoners in the back. That's still under communist control. When we came forward and shook the general's hand, we were now under American control. And a crew member from this big, beautiful Air Force medevac C-141, one of the crew members would walk us individually out to the aircraft and show us to our seat in the back of the 141. When the whole ceremony was over, we took off from Hanoi and headed to the Philippines.
Boy, you look in high spirits for what all you've gone through and are, I'm sure, still suffering quite a bit at this point in time. But to be in American hands, I'm sure that that you were on cloud nine.
Yeah, I was.
Wow. And as you're, I can't remember if you end up leaving for good.
I'm sorry, you asked me a question that I didn't answer for some reason. Nothing to do with my age. I don't turn 80 till December. About the MACV.
Oh, Mr. John and Carol Flora.
Caviani and Ed Flora were both with me in that section of the Hanoi Hilton that you show there. I was with both those guys and got to know them pretty well. And of course, Caviani, that's Flora, I think. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I don't know who the gentleman over here is.
Wait a minute. I'm going to put on some glasses there.
I think that's Mr. Flora.
Yeah, I think that's Flora, and I think that might be Dick Anches, if that's right. It's hard to tell from that picture this long ago, but sure could be if that's Anches. But yeah, so Caviani first. Caviani got the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions at the time of his capture, for what he did to take care of his guys and kind of be a last man rear guard fighting battle to be sure the rest of his guys got extracted, and then he got captured. And he was a special forces sergeant, and it was at a site during the Battle of Quezon, and I think it was a hilltop. I don't want to get it completely wrong, but I think it was just to the west of Quezon. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, heroic actions there. MACV-SOG guy who ended up with me in Hanoi, and yeah, I knew him there, and I continued to stay in touch with him Afterwards, we ended up with some time together in an assignment in Washington, D.C. after the war.
Wow.
The other guy, Ed Flora, and for I would say this for almost all of us, me certainly, and a good number of the prisoners captured in the South were held as missing in action for the entire war, MIA. In fact, there's another Special Forces guy. He wasn't MACV-SOG. I might have mentioned him on an earlier podcast. I don't know. Jim Thompson. He was the commander. He was the commander of the Special Forces detachment at Quezon. I think the first detachment that was there, and he was on an aerial recon flying backseat in a bird dog piloted by an Air Force pilot. When they went down to look at a bridge, got shot down, pilot killed, Jim badly hurt, and captured in April of 1964. So often the credit for the longest held prisoner in the Vietnam War sometimes goes to Ev Alvarez, who was the first pilot shot down over the north when the war started. But about 6 months prior to his capture, Jim Thompson had been captured in the south. So Jim Thompson was indeed the longest held prisoner from the Vietnam War. So that's another Special Forces guy. He was not working SOG missions at the time. So yeah, Caviani, I believe was MACV-SOG, and then Ed Flora for sure had been on a recon team and was being extracted. Well, I don't have all the details.
Jungle penetrator, shot off the penetrator.
Yeah, he was shot off, and I don't know if it was on, I don't know what type of penetrator. I've heard everything from a McGuire rig to penetrator to clipped on a rope or whatever, but he came off at some altitude that I think was estimated to be 100 feet or so.
Yeah.
But whatever it was, he survived the fall, and though he was carried as missing in action for the entire war, at the end he comes out. And I remember, I'll never forget Ed Flora. He's passed away now, regrettably, like so many of these guys. His arm was badly broken, both bones in the forearm, and it was off at an angle, just a weird broken angle. And he'd just salute for grins with this weird salute. He swore, though he must have got it fixed when he got back, but he would say, "Hey, if we ever get released from here, I'm going to keep that arm just like that. I'm not going to get it fixed."
What a guy. I mean, y'all, the way y'all just lean into it and go with it. I mean, that's what makes y'all survivors. I mean, that's like you said, to be able to stay strong in your own mind, live in your own mind, and enjoy things. Think about what you're going to do when you get out. The 23rd Psalm seemed to do quite a bit of justice for you when you were down and thinking about giving up, getting you through. And in the book, it comes through great. It quite frankly, as I said at the beginning, every Vietnam fan, historian, what have you, needs to own this book. There's not anything like it I've ever read, and I've read quite a few books so far. But to close out, and I'll let you have the last word after this as we're closing. But could you? I can't remember if this is when you're being released or not, but when there's a young guard and he comes up to you, I believe you're on a truck, and the lieutenant has to translate, but he wanted to learn English and had learned to say goodbye and wanted to say goodbye to you.
This was at the camp. This was on the journey north, working towards Hanoi. It was in North Vietnam. It was the camp where Wayne Finch died. This guard was one of the civilian. In fact, I think he was the civilian militia guy that Kay had traded his pen for the potatoes for me, and Kay would chat with him, whispering through the wall of the thing there at night sometimes. But anyway, we got on the truck. That was one of the few times we rode a truck. We never rode a truck anywhere in the Ho Chi Minh Trail up through Laos. Inside North Vietnam, if it wasn't an area of real high bomb threat, we'd ride trucks. But that probably was maybe 1, 2, 3 or 4 times for the entire trip did we ride trucks. But that was one time we got on a truck to leave that camp, and the guy came up, looked up at me, and in English said, "Goodbye." And then Kay told me as we pulled out, he said, "Yeah, I worked with that guy," because he wanted to learn to say goodbye to you. So yeah, that was one of the very few positive interactions with any communist during that time.
That's strange, but very neat in a way that he wanted to learn English and at least be able to say goodbye to you. I mean, that's just neat. There was one question. This is a good one considering. Did you happen to go to survival school in between your tours or at all before you got to Vietnam or SEER school?
No.
No.
Well, and I don't want to drag this on for another half hour.
Yeah.
No, but no, I didn't. The Army did not have a SEER school in those days. They did not have any kind of a survival school. What I did go to, this was halfway through my first tour in Vietnam, flying Mohawks, after I'd been shot down, almost captured and pulled out on a jungle penetrator. I got to go to the Navy Survival School in the Philippines, which was only that, survival. We didn't learn any SEER stuff at all for prison camps. We did learn how to survive in the jungle and kill snakes and lizards and make things out of bamboo and all. So I had that experience. Because after I got back from the war, I was picked as part of a 10-man form. I was picked as one of 10 former Army POWs to go brief the Chief of Staff of the Army on our experience. Part of that briefing and part of a small sub briefing that I was one of 3 guys briefing the chief on was the fact that the Army did not have a survival school. There's a young, dark-haired Army captain with so yeah, that's what I was looking like when I went to brief the chief. But the briefing to the chief and the Army staff was, hey, the biggest challenge we faced as prisoners was just not knowing, the whole unknown of the experience, that we really needed a survival school like the Air Force and the Navy had, the Air Force School at Fairchild, Navy survival programs. And so we strongly recommended the Army do that. There were some on the staff, I don't remember who's, why do we want to train our soldiers to give up in battle? No. But at any rate, as a result of that briefing, the Army did make the decision to start an Army SEER program. They brought Colonel Nick Rowe back on active duty to get the school started at Fort Bragg. And now there's a subsequent school at Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I'm very proud that my presentation to the Chief of Staff of the Army played a part in getting the Army SEER program cranked up and going.
Wow. That's amazing, and thank God you did, because you go through it several times in the book. You hold firm to the name, rank, and serial number, but you also let people know that if people want to break you, they're gonna break you. A man can only hold out so long under these circumstances. Not that you or anybody else broke, but just saying men need to know, what they're going to be facing up against, and know that some things aren't breaking and some things are, and get that cleared up out of the way. So that's amazing.
I could have been broken. Anybody can be broken. I had the good fortune, if there's any good fortune in all of this, of being captured late in the war and only spending just under a year in captivity. I mean, many prisoners were 5, 7 years in captivity. Jim Thompson and Ev Alvarez were right at 9 years in captivity. I was lucky. I was, in fact, the last U.S. Army soldier captured in the Vietnam War who survived. Anyone captured after me did not survive to come out at the end. There were guys captured after me, but they were Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps pilots for the most part. I was the last Army guy captured who survived.
Jeez Louise. What an honor to have. And thank God you were the last one and made it. That's tough. It's a tough story, and it's a heck of a book. But it'll definitely get the emotions flowing. It's one of my favorites, and I'll be reading it again as soon as my copy comes in. Mr. Woody, who's in the chat, let me borrow his copy, and I've got to have my own. But
Woody in the chat?
He is. He got here a little early and had to jump back on. But yes, he's been with us in the chat.
Woody, I wish you well. He's one of my favorite best friends from the Pink. I think I told my Woody story in my Pink Panther segment. So you can listen to that.
Yeah, how you even got there was Woody played a little part in, electric part in it, shall we say?
Yeah, he's the reason I later got shot down and became a prisoner of war. Thanks a lot, Woody.
Yes, Red. His book is on Amazon, and I'll if you come back in a minute, it'll all be linked in the description. But is there anything you would like to close out with? I know I've held you longer than we agreed on, but is there anything you'd like to add before we close out?
Two other very quick comments in the book. We talked about MACV-SOG guys, two other special forces guys I wanted to mention, Dennis Thompson and Harvey Brandy. They were captured at Long Bay. There was also a guy, William McMurray, captured there with them. The Battle of Long Bay, one hell of a fight. There's another book on that, Night of the Silver Stars. Dennis particularly was captured standing about knee deep in blood and bodies. It was a heck of a fight. So those guys are recognized in the book. Their stories are in there. The last thing I will say, you mentioned the 23rd Psalm. The title of the book is Through the Valley. That comes Through the Valley, My Captivity in Vietnam. That title comes directly from the 23rd Psalm, which I said over and over and over again, particularly that little piece. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. That gave me a lot of comfort during my months of captivity.
Can't think of a better way to end this. I'll let you have the last word on that. And guys, please jump over to Amazon or jump on the link and please get this. And if you can, all three of his books are worth having. They cover absolutely amazing topics. Two of them cover his tour, but also men that served with him. And then one is for the firebase attack that he helped Major Duffy in. So it's outstanding. So guys, we're going to shut it down for the day. I hope all of y'all have a great day. Thank y'all for joining us. And Mr. Bill, thank you for closing out your trilogy today with a wonderful show. We thank you for joining us.
Thank you, bud.
Yes, sir. Have a good day.